Happy to introduce Phil Blanson, who is a postdoc at the University of Edinburgh with the language group, right? You can say language machine translation group, yes.
The MT, yes.
Yeah,
The mighty empire.
And we'll be talking about some interesting work from this year's MIPS as well as ACL and EM, I think. The combination.
Broad coverage.
Yeah.
Okay, so can you hear me? Is the mic on?
It's for the recording, not for the room.
Okay. Okay, so as Shankar said, I'm Phil Blanton. This work that I've been doing at the University of Edinburgh with my collaborators Miles and Trevor. And okay, so what I'll be talking about today, so obviously I'll start with some introduction, and I'm going to motivate the work we've been doing to apply ideas from machine learning to machine translation, and two bits of work in particular. The first using discriminative modeling techniques, and the second using generative Bayesian modeling techniques. And I'll motivate why we might be interested in both. Okay, so this talk's going to be quite sort of MT heavy and machine learning heavy at the same time. So if I assume too much, please stop me. Okay, so to start with some motivation. So I see the current approaches to machine translation all mostly fitting, statistical machine translation, fitting within a dominant paradigm in which we have a pipeline of processes that we go through, and we've sort of come up with this over time by sort of hand engineering heuristic techniques, trying things, and when they work, keeping them, when they don't, not doing them. So the current sort of approach is we start with a parallel corpus. We train a cascade of word alignment models, something like the IBM word alignment models. We learn word translation models, but then we throw away those translation models and just keep the alignments. Then we have heuristics for taking those alignments, adding extra points, combining them, until we end up with a phrase table, or a grammar in the synchronous grammar sense. Okay. So then we have more heuristics for scoring those phrases. We throw the lot into a minimum error rate training regime, and at the end we have a translation model. And although this works and gives us the state of the art for machine translation, it doesn't really give us a well-defined model of translation in a probabilistic sense or in a machine learning sense. And pipelines like this can make life difficult when we want to extend them. If we change something, the results can be unpredictable. If we make the word alignments better, often it makes no impact at all on the end translations. So we'd like something more well-defined in a modeling sense. So I'd argue that something more like this might be appropriate, in which we think of translation as grammar induction, or if you're talking about phrase-based models, phrase table induction. And then structured prediction, so where we have where we train a model to do the translation task. So what I'll talk about today is these two ideas. So first I'll talk about discriminative training a model. So given a grammar and a parallel corpus, using discriminative training to train a translation model. This is a difficult machine learning task. So it falls under the heading of structured prediction, structured classification. And that's something that's quite popular at the moment in machine learning. But our current models are limited to quite simple structural tasks like pos tagging, parsing, where the correspondence between the structure and the underlying data is well known and not very ambiguous. In translation, the relationships are very ambiguous. We don't know what the process is to go from a source sentence to a target sentence. So we have the input and the output, but we have very little idea about what happens in between. And so we really need some sort of sense of latent variables. And so for this, I use a probabilistic model. Okay, so that's the discriminative modeling. And after that, I'll talk about some initial work I've been doing using Bayesian models to do the grammar induction task. And so my feeling is that word alignments are somewhat incidental to the translation process, and what we actually want to do is not alignment but grammar induction. And I'll talk about that, and I'll talk about how we could apply some non-parametric Bayesian techniques to doing that. Okay, so we'll start with the discriminative modeling. So all the work I'll talk about today is based on synchronous grammar models of translation. It all essentially applies without too much difficulty to phrase-based, finite state-based models. But I choose synchronous grammar models because they have nice polynomial algorithms, and they also have nice correspondences with monolingual parsing. So there's a huge body of work in parsing that we can draw upon to inspire machine translation. And also there's plenty of state-of-the-art results using synchronous grammar, so we know that it's possible to get good results. So this is just an example grammar on the left there, a simple SCFG. And I'll just run through a derivation using that grammar so that you can understand what I'm talking about. So at the top is a grammar, at the bottom I'll run through a derivation, and I'll just highlight the rules I'm using as I do that. So first we start with a start symbol using the start symbol rule. Using the rule for rewriting an S as an X, we can replace that S. We can then use the lexical translation rule to translate il to he. We can then capture the ne pas construction in French using a gapped rule. And finally, when we insert the verb, we get the full translation. So this is what I'll refer to as a derivation in the synchronous grammar. And it's these derivations which I'll principally be concerned with modelling and be talking about. Okay, so we want to model the probability of a derivation, the conditional probability. And so here the derivation is D, the source sentence is F, maybe for foreign, and the target sentence is E, maybe for English. And so here we use a log linear model. And so we have on the top a sum over the feature function h on the derivations, and we normalize by z, which is the partition function. And that's the sum over the probabilities for all the derivations. Okay. So given that we can state the probability of a derivation, we'd like the probability of a translation, E, given the source F. And we get that by marginalizing out the derivations, so summing over all the derivations, because the derivations are ambiguous. So multiple derivations can give the same translation. So we can get the marginal probability of the translation by marginalizing. And this step, although not done in current translation system, we need to think about this if we want to have large sparse feature sets with millions of features. And so it's something we need to take into account. And and we want to have large sparse feature sets. So the most interesting thing about this modeling, and the whole reason we might be interested in it, is so we can have interesting features. So like other structured prediction tasks, the first thing we have to do is assume that the feature function capital HZ decomposes with the derivation so that we can use dynamic programming. So we assume that the features decompose with the rules that we apply, and we assume that those feature functions are a function of the entire source sentence. So for every rule application, we can use features from any part of the source, any part of the rule that we're applying, and finally this function Q that I'll get to in a moment, which will give us non-local features. So the first two, the source and the rule, can give us a large selection of powerful features. We can model syntax from the source of the sentence. We could have multiple syntax annotations, dependency trees, and we could incorporate features over all of these things. Okay, but the second part there, the function Q, we're going to use to give us non-local features on the translation. And the reason we want non-local features is because we know that language models help machine translation. So we need to be able to fit a language model in somewhere. So the function Q here, if those of you that are familiar with the David Chang's Hiero system will recognize it. This is just the function he defines for the language model. And I've just got a small German example there. So this function gives us the boundary words of a cell in the derivation. And if we have a language model of order n, then it'll give us n-1 words on either side of that cell. So if we've got a bigram language model, as in this example, the function Q gives us one word on either side of the cell that we're looking at. So in this example, we can see that at the first step, we can translate each word in the source as a single word. The second step, we can combine two together, as in everything and, which spans the source words 1 to 3. And when we go for the final step, spanning 1 to 4, we elide the middle of the string and we only need to store the boundary words. So those of you that have looked at synchronous grammar translation, this will be very familiar to. So incorporating this into our feature functions, we can now have a language model as a feature, but we can also have any features which combine this target context with the source. So we can look at the source syntax and we can combine that with the lexical context and all sorts of other things that we might dream up, like lexicalized reordering or many options. Okay, so far it's all well and good. We've got a nice description of a model with interesting features. But the problem with doing this is that by incorporating the non-local features, the dynamic programs become intractable. So they're still polynomial, but they're a very high order polynomial in the length of the sentence, and thus we're going to have to approximate somehow. And so here I'm showing this in the equation by saying that we're going to approximate z with the partition function with z tilde, and highlighted in red there, we're going to say that rather than summing over all the derivations, we're just going to sum over a subset. And we need to calculate the partition function in order to train the model and to calculate the feature expectations that we need to calculate the gradient. Okay. So the interesting thing now becomes what subset of derivation should we choose? And a first obvious approach to doing this might be to use just the standard beam search techniques that we have in machine translation to produce a pack chart and use the space represented by that pack chart to define the partition function. So I'll call that the first approach, and I'll call that the beam approximation. A problem with an approximation like that, and it's a problem that other approaches like using n-best lists suffer from, is that doing that we're only getting a very compact point estimate around the maximum of the function we're interested in. But if we want to estimate the function, we'd really like a bit more from the tail of the distribution. So we'd like a more scattered set of points so that we get a better feel for the shape and don't make silly assumptions by just seeing the peak of the distribution. So a suggested alternative is to sample derivations. And so what I'm proposing is that we first train a model without the non-local features, which I call P minus LM. And we can do this exactly. It's a cubic, it has cubic complexity. And then we can draw samples from that model, and we can pack those into a pack chart representation and use that to approximate Z. And the hope here is that although most of our samples will be from the peak of the distribution, we'll also see some samples from the tails. And maybe this will give us a less biased sample, less biased approximation. So a diagrammatic representation of what I'm talking about. So in the top left, we have a German example of sampled derivation. So this is what we've sampled from our minus LM model. On the right, we have a pack chart representation of that. So we take the sample, we create a pack chart representation where it's similar to the representation I used previously with the language model context and the spans of the cells represented there. So we sample a second derivation, and again we add that to the pack chart. And there's quite a bit of overlap, so we only need to add a couple of extra chart cells. And so now we have an efficient representation of those two derivations. And then we can see that we actually, in that in that packed chart, we have a third derivation that we never added. So by doing this sampling procedure, we're building a space, a much larger space of derivations than we're actually adding. And yes.
So do we know what is this sampling doing here? Because I mean, in a way, you then are adjusting the parameters in training this model. So when you remove the part that has to do with information provided by the language model, it's not clear to me whether the distribution is going to be kind of broader or narrow, because it's sort of
There's going to be a change, so it's
It's well, I get that, but the question is what kind of change? Is a change that's favorable or unfavorable? I mean, there's sort of this intuition that, by sampling without the language model, maybe I hit these things near the tail and then I censor them with the language model. But as you train, then you're taking advantage of the language model. It's not clear to me that when you remove the line, not only to make some things less probable, but also to make some other things more probable.
Yeah.
So it's not clear to me that by removing language model, what you get when sample without language model later down the training.
So what we get is we can't sample with a language model, so it's just the best we can do. So,
Compared to what? No, yeah.
Although we suffer the same problem with the beam search because we need parameters to beam search with. So again, we need some starting point. I agree, it's definitely an approximation. So it's really whether the empirical results support it.
So I guess what I'm wondering is there a sort of a toy problem where you can actually have a precise answer to this question? Sort of synthetic data that could give us some intuition as to what
the answer would depend on the toy problem. So there would be problems for which it depends on how important the language model is compared to the underlying distribution. The more the divergence, then the more it's going to matter that it's a different distribution that you're sampling from. If you wanted to do this exactly, you'd use a Metropolis-Hastings algorithm and you'd have an acceptance step. And I've tried that, but it's really slow. So this is trying to strike a balance between fast and exact. So
the reason I'm asking this is there's sort of a bunch of different ideas like this popping around, not only machine translation, but in other areas where intractable inference and structured prediction will arrive. And everybody's doing things, and I have no confidence that any of those things are good, bad, or indifferent because of I don't know. No one seems to understand what the underlying math is.
Yeah, no, it's very true. There's not a theoretical analysis, so it is reliant upon empirically whether it gives us good performance, basically.
Is this not something where you can vary the sampling density to get a better idea of whether you're heading in the right direction or not?
So that's what something like a Metropolis-Hastings step would give you. It would allow you to try and sample more from, it would allow you to sample from the correct distribution rather than the incorrect one.
That's kind of my rough intuition, right? Obviously, as your sampling tends to infinity, you're kind of, as your sampling density goes to infinity, you're kind of converging on the exact model in principle, yeah? No?
Well, no, because we're not sampling from the correct distribution. We're sampling from the model without the language model. So it's very true that it's not the exact same distribution.
You're doing a bias sample.
Yeah. And there are ways we could bias that to be the correct distribution, but it imposes a heavy computational cost.
Right.
So, I mean, there's two ways to think of it. One is to think of it as trying to approximate a proper sampling procedure, and another is to try and add a bit of noise to a beam search-like approach to try and make it more stable. So it depends which angle you're coming from. But I agree that I think we could do a lot more analysis of trying to learn what are good ways to do this. But it all becomes difficult with dealing with very large problems.
So I have a question about, is there something in the packed forest construction that makes you get a new derivation? Because I would think that it's possible to construct the forest in a way that it just has the stuff you put in.
Yeah, you could choose to do that.
Okay.
And you would end up, so if you thought of it conceptually as using an infinite language model order so that you never elided the strings, then you would not get anything that you hadn't inserted.
Okay.
But as soon as you start eliding the strings, you will be able to get other derivations in there.
this is the analog to this is the sausage in the speech, right? So if you have the sausage like lattice,
Yeah.
then you can get new stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, very much. Okay. Okay, so we've talked about approximating the partition function, and we need that for training. And this is our training objective. It's a relatively normal-looking log linear model objective, where we have a likelihood and a prior term. I haven't talked about the prior today, but there's more about that in my EMNLP paper. So the procedure we go through is to first train this model without the language model, use that to drive either the beam search or the sampler. We create these pack chart representations, and then we train the model with the language model features using these pack chart representations and standard dynamic programming algorithms, i.e. the inside-outside algorithm. Okay, so that's the description of the model. So the experiments we've done, so what I've done is taken the IWSLT Chinese English data, which is a smallish data set. It's got about 40,000 training examples. I'm using the Hiero rule extraction heuristic to give the underlying grammar. And because that is a heuristic, there's no generative model there. It doesn't guarantee that it doesn't guarantee that it covers the training corpus. So there's source and target sentences in the training corpus that we can't produce from that grammar, and so we lose 2,000 sentences for training. So I have those test and development set, and so one notable thing about this this corpus is that there's a very large number of references, 16. One reference was from the original translated corpus, and the other 15 references are paraphrase. This creates some funny effects with blue and the brevity penalty that I'll talk about in the results. And the basic model I'll talk about here just has a very simple representation. There's one feature on each rule, a word penalty, and a language model. And really, with this very simple model, we're just trying to work out whether the model will learn a sensible translation model, given a very simple representation. And so when we evaluate this model, it's on the development data. If we look at our two, we first look at the model without the language model and the model with. We can see that there's quite a difference. This is encouraging. It implies that we've managed to leverage the information from the language model, and now our approximations are working in some sense to estimate that language model feature weight and the word penalty and the other features. If we compare the two approximations, there's little difference between them. So the results are quite similar. However, if we take the sampling model, it's actually producing charts which are roughly half the size of the beam search, so it's much more computationally efficient. So with a much smaller set of derivations, it's producing a better estimate. So I'll use that approximation in the next experiments.
Does the beam include the language model? Or?
Yes.
It does.
Yeah. So both those bottom two are including a language model.
So,
can you estimate, so comparing those two solutions, right? So you have a chart, beam search chart of sparse forest, and they have the sampling-based sparse forest. Can you do some statistics on those two, comparing those two, to see what's happening?
You could do so. I mean, I've given the broad, high-level statistic of 50% smaller. You could actually count the number of derivations and look at the space that's in there. So the answer is I haven't done those statistics, but you could. Sure, it'd be tractable to also look at the actual lexical diversity in the charts as well.
I mean, feature diversity maybe, something like that.
So the aim here is that the sampling chart will have a lot more diversity in it, but so I'm just assuming that from the result and the smaller chart. Okay. Now if we move to the test set and compare with a standard, so a MERT trained model, and this is a David Chang's standard Hiero model with all the features it normally has, such as lexical model 1 smoothing and such things. And I include both the NIST and IBM interpretations of the brevity penalty in blue. So we see that when we look at the NIST brevity penalty results. The MERT model comes out looking quite good. So the NIST brevity penalty takes the shortest reference in the set of references. Because we have 16 references and they were paraphrased, we basically get an even distribution over short and long. So the short is quite short. So that model is producing very short output. When we look at the IBM metric, which takes the closest, we see that there's a closer relationship between the result. And the final result is just using the single reference from the original corpus. And that's the scenario that the probabilistic model was trained under, because it was just trained on single references. It has no sense of brevity penalties. It just tries to produce translations looking like the corpus. And under that scenario, it comes out quite comparable. It's very difficult to compare models like this. They're doing very different things. They're optimizing different objectives. So my argument here is not that one model is better than the other. It's just that we can be confident that our model is in the same ballpark. It's producing state-of-the-art results.
What about MERT with the IBM Blue?
You'd expect the IBM to go up then.
Yeah. Just would be another data point.
Yeah, you could run it with all of them. But yeah, as I said, I'm not arguing that one is better than the other, because I don't think they're comparable. We really need to look at a human evaluation or some such thing. But our model's not optimizing Blue at all. So we're quite happy that it's coming out with reasonable Blue scores. Okay, so that's the basic model, and we've shown that we can get state-of-the-art results. So now we'd like to add some interesting features and see if we can still estimate a good model. So an obvious starting point is to add supervised syntax from a source syntax tree. Now, there's been a lot of work incorporating syntax into translation models, and it's usually done by inserting the syntax into the grammar of a synchronous grammar-based model. So here we're taking a different approach and just treating the syntax as conditioning context. So we're separating the search space, which is defined by the grammar, from the parameterization. And this has advantages. This means that we don't have to worry where translation units don't correspond to syntactic constituents. We don't have to have heuristic ways of dealing with that. In that case, the features just aren't present. So we're going to extract rules which correspond to syntactic fragments. And this amounts to about 4 million features. And so in total, we'll have about 7 million features in the model. So an example of what this looks like. Please forgive my anglicised Chinese parse tree. So a simple derivation. The derivation is represented in the top right there. There's 2 steps in the derivation. First, we translate the noun phrase for currency exchange office, and then the question part of the sentence. And so in the first step, we extract a syntactic feature which says that for that translation pair, the Chinese source was covered by a noun phrase. And so the translation pair can now be conditioned on that property that there was a noun phrase present. In the second step, we can have the feature which says, for the question rule, the variable x that we're incorporating corresponds to a noun phrase, and the whole lot corresponds to a question. So this allows the model to learn a bias for corresponding to the parse tree. If it thinks that the parse tree provides interesting information, it can learn to use rules which correspond to constituents. So when we throw those features into the model, we get slight improvements, but nothing dramatic. So this might seem quite reasonable that we give some additional features and we see some improvements. For me, actually, this is quite positive because I was expecting more that the model would go down. So the features mostly are all noise, because 4 million syntactic features, very few of them are going to hold any information at all. So all we're really doing is throwing a huge amount of noise with a little bit of signal in there somewhere. And the fact that the model's actually found a little bit of that signal is quite encouraging to me.
Is there a minimum count cutoff on those features?
Yes, there is. They have to occur twice.
Twice.
Yeah. So singletons are removed. Yeah. Otherwise, you'd get a great deal. Okay, so
you get a great deal of
features.
yeah, but it's just a computational issue. I mean, you are smoothly regularizing these
Yes,
models,
yes,
right?
I've skipped over the regularization, but so there is some stuff going on with the regularization. It's basically a minimum divergence style model where we're so again, when we're going from the model without the language model to the model with, I train it essentially as a minimum divergence model from the original model, because when we do that approximation of Z, we lose a huge number of the features because we're not considering all the derivations now. And their weights would go to 0 if we didn't do something. And that was quite effective. And it sort of makes sense that when we add the translation model, we expect things to get better, but we don't expect the model to change dramatically. It should still, the weights on the translation rules should still stay reasonably within the same range. So that's, so I presented the discriminative model. So now I'll move on to some work with a generative Bayesian model. So what we'd like to do here is, so as I said in that previous model, we were using the hiero grammar, but really we'd like to be able to induce the synchronous grammars without having to rely upon word alignments, such things. So that's our end aim. There hasn't been a great deal of work on inducing synchronous grammars. Current approaches in translation are based on heuristics, such as the hiero heuristic or other ones, sometimes using supervised parse trees. They have problems. They produce massive grammars, hundreds of millions of rules even for medium-sized corpora, most of which are just noise. And they don't, as I talked about previously, we have this reachability problem where they don't actually guarantee that they'll model the data they were extracted from. So we'd like to treat this as a grammar induction process and induce synchronous grammars. And so we're going to try some Bayesian techniques inspired by similar ideas in monolingual parsing. So to come back to that example, so in this section on the generative models, I'm going to restrict what I'm talking about to ITG models, and they're models where synchronous grammars where we either have purely lexicalized emission rules or we have binary productions. So maybe we'd hope to be able to learn ITGs like this, where we can learn the correspondences in translation, but some sort of labeling on the constituents within the derivation. And maybe we can learn that certain labels for constituents have a higher probability of reordering or occurring after or near in combination with other labels. So this is the sort of thing that ideally we might like to learn. And so in these models we have three types of rules. We have monotone productions, that is a parent produces 2 children and the order on the source and the target are the same. Reordering productions, which are shown with a diamond, there where again a parent produces 2 children but the order on the target is reversed. And then the third type of rule is just the emissions, so they're at the leaves where we produce the actual phrasal translations. So what we would like to do is take some of the work in monolingual parsing, and here the model of Percy-Liang applying hierarchical Dirichlet processes to modelling a PCFG, and extend that to work with a synchronous grammar. So extend it to 2 dimensions, and hopefully we can use the stick-breaking prior construction from Percy-Liang's work to have a prior over these constituents and hopefully learn an interesting set of constituents for our model at the same time as learning the translation correspondence. So now I'll start talking about these Bayesian models. So there's 2 main building blocks that we're using in this model. The first is the stick-breaking construction, and that's our prior over the number of constituents. And so what it does, it gives us a sparse prior distribution over an infinite number of constituents. And the way we do that, so we represent this with a stick. So in the middle there we have this idea of a stick, and it has unit length, so it's length 1, and we break off bits as we produce the prior. And the expectation of the length of these broken sticks is decreasing. So sometimes we might break off a bigger one than the previous, but the expectation over time is that they'll decrease. And that's parameterized by a hyperparameter alpha. And this is produced using a beta distribution, so we draw these pi dash, pi prime, if you like, parameters from a beta distribution. We then break them off from our unit length stick and scale by the remaining length. And you can see that will give us a decreasing, or an expectation of a decreasing length. And we can keep doing that to infinity. So that's what we use to give us a prior over the labels. Using that prior, those pi values, so what we need in a grammar base, an SCFG, is a distribution over pairs of labels, because in our model we have the source, the parent category producing a pair of children labels. So we need a distribution over pairs. And we do that by taking the cross product of the pi distribution. So we take the infinite pi distribution, take the cross product to give us a distribution over pairs, an infinite distribution over pairs. And we use that as the base distribution of a Dirichlet process. Okay. So this next slide gets a little bit heavy. But I'll walk through it slowly and try and give the intuition for the model, and I'll follow this up with a diagram to try and help. So on the left, I'm going to describe the generation process from this grammar, and on the right, I'm going to highlight the priors which are being used. And what I want to do is highlight the hierarchical relationship between the priors, so to give an intuition of how they're sharing the same distributions. So at the top, we start by drawing a start symbol. And we'll call that Z1. So we'll label the node in the tree as Z. We first draw a start symbol. Okay. So first I'll say something about the notation. So the bar here indicates independence. So given phi s, then the Z draws are independent from the multinomial. So we're drawing Zi from a multinomial parameterized by phi s in the first instance. Then on the right, we can see that highlighted in red there on the second line, phi s itself is distributed according to a Dirichlet process. So that's a sparse prior over these infinite number of categories. And the categories come from the top level stick breaking prior. So we have a two-level prior distribution going on here. We have first the Dirichlet process, and then it itself draws upon the infinite set of categories defined by the stick breaking prior. And that top level distribution is how we link all these things together. Okay. So once we have a start symbol, we then need to draw a type of our rule. So again, I said we had three types of rules: monotone, reordering, and emission. So the first thing we need to draw is a type. The type is somewhat simpler. Its prior distribution is just a finite Dirichlet distribution, because we only have three types. There's no infinite things going on here. So we draw our type from a sparse distribution over those three types. So given that we may have drawn a monotone production, and here we see...
Sorry, so the type, the phi of sub zi, this is the distribution of the possible types for
the parent.
For zi, the terminal zi, non-terminal zi.
Yep.
And that comes from a single set, there's a single Dirichlet alpha 1, super y. So that means that you have a single prior. So you're thinking about each of those sort of rule type distribution, just all drawn from the same prior.
No, they're separate priors, so that's phi z. So there's for each...
No, there's a different one for each subscript.
Yes.
But they all drawn, they are all,
They all
dice drawn from the same dice factory.
They all have the same hyperparameter. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So monotone productions, here in this somewhat cumbersome notation, we have Z1 and Z2 having the same order on the source and target. We draw that from a multinomial, and again, we draw its prior from a Dirichlet process. This time, however, because we're drawing pairs of constituents, the base distribution of the Dirichlet process is that cross product that I talked about. So that gives us a base distribution over pairs of constituents. But then at the top level, it's linked to the same stick breaking prior that the start constituent distribution was. So they're both, the stick breaking prior is allowing us to draw, for these distributions, they're all drawing on the same set of constituents. So they're all sharing the same inventory of constituents. And so for the reordering rule, it's essentially equivalent to the monotone production, except that we have a separate, again, we have a separate multinomial, a separate Dirichlet process, but the same top-level stick-breaking prior. And finally, for the emission distribution, we again draw from a Dirichlet process. So here you can think of the infinite process being every possible translation pair that we could have. So every source and target phrase. And so we have an infinite distribution over those. And its base distribution is some prior P0 that I'll talk about in a moment. But we can parameterize that prior distribution over phrase pairs. So that's the basic statement of the model in a somewhat complex form.
A tiny bit. Where does the Y come from in your prior? What's that Y representing?
The alpha Y.
Phi TZ? Yeah.
Sorry, the superscript is just it's not a power. Sorry. So the alpha, all the alphas are hyperparameters. Sorry. So they're all handset parameters. So yeah, we have the hyperparameters alpha S. We have top level alpha, alpha S, alpha Y, alpha M, alpha R. They're all hyperparameters for tuning the priors. Yeah. Ooh, this is broken. Oh, sorry. The battery from flat. Okay, so I'll run through an instance of generating with this model. So as I mentioned previously, first we draw a start symbol from our inventory of symbols, and we'll give this the label 1. We then draw a type for that symbol, and the box indicates that we've drawn the type of a monotone production. So from the multinomial there for the rule types. We then draw for the monotone production 2 children from the that distribution that had the prior distribution using the cross product of constituents. And then for each child we draw again a rule type, and this one we draw an emission, and we draw a pair of source and target phrases, in this case just question marks. And we continue through this process. So we draw a reordering rule type, we draw its 2 children, and we keep going through this process, drawing the emissions. So there we draw the translations for the current year. Here I've accounted for the reordering that's happening at the constituent label 2. And you can see, we might see that the model is reusing categories because it has a prior to bias it towards reusing categories it's already seen over introducing new categories. And so we keep generating until we have a complete translation. So that's the basic process that we're modeling. So when I talked about the emission distributions, I said that we have the ability to introduce a prior P0. And so I'm just going to talk about 3 different options that we might try for that. The obvious one is just to have a uniform prior over phrase pairs. The second one is to draw on the IBM translation models, and we can use IBM Model 1 to give us a prior over phrase pairs. And the third one is to use the heuristic relative frequency estimator that's most commonly used in translation to give us the prior distribution. So Model 1 should be reasonably familiar to many of you. The only interesting thing here is that we actually need a joint distribution, so we have a language model in that prior as well. We just use a simple unigram language model. That gives us a joint probability for all possible phrase pairs. And the thing to note about Model 1 is it has a bias towards short phrase pairs. So we expect that the longer the phrase pair, the lower its probability is going to be. So the relative frequency estimator, it's simply taken a word-aligned corpus and a phrase extraction heuristic, just counts the number of times phrases are extracted. And that's what I symbolize here in that equation with C being a counting function. Here again, we want a joint distribution, so we're normalizing by the total number of phrases we extracted rather than using a conditional model, which is more popular in machine translation. And the thing about this estimator is that it's biased for longer phrase pairs. So this is a common property of current phrase-based or synchronous grammar translation systems. They actually have a strong bias towards using long phrase pairs. So we need some way of training this model, and that can be difficult. So by having all these distributions and taking the Bayesian approach of integrating out the parameters, what we've done is induced dependencies between all the distributions. So there's no independence, so there's no efficient dynamic program that we can use to estimate the model. So an exact solution to solving such a model is to use something like Gibbs sampling. And this is popular, it's quite slow, and has some, it takes some hand tuning to get to work. What I'll do instead is use a popular approximation called the variational mean field approach. And I'm not going to describe this in detail, it's quite, it's reasonably complicated, but the intuition is quite straightforward, so I'll just describe that. And so what we're going to do in our approximation, we want to estimate the probability distribution P. But we can't do that because of all these dependencies. So what we're going to say is that we know of another distribution Q, which does decompose between the parameters theta, and Z is the trees for our, the derivation trees for our parallel corpus. So we know of another distribution that does decompose, and then what we can do is try and minimize the divergence between the model we want, P, and the model that we can actually estimate, Q. And we're hoping that that will give us a good approximation of the model we're trying to learn. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that, but I'll gloss over that for the moment. So what this looks like, it essentially looks like EM training for anyone that is familiar with EM training for maximum likelihood. And I'll try and show you why it looks like that, even though it may look quite different, this equation at the top. So the process is that we go through a process of, we have what we define rule weights for all our for all the rules in our grammar. And this is just an example rule re-estimation equation at the top, which I'll describe. So we have rule weights, and we go through the process just like EM of calculating expectations on our parallel corpus, and then re-estimating the rule weights, and we re-estimate using this function. So this is just for the reordering distribution. We have similar equations for the monotone and for the emission distributions. They're all essentially similar. So now if I just highlight in red there, we have the counting there, or the expectations. That's basically what you do in EM. So inside there is basically a normal EM update step. And all we've done is added some extra, this digamma function and a term from the prior, which looks very much like additive smoothing or something like that. So basically this is, if you have a implementation of an EM algorithm, turning it into variational algorithm is incredibly simple. You just add the digamma function and the terms from the prior. There's a third step besides expectations and re-estimation that doesn't have an equivalent in the EM model, and that is we need to re-estimate this top-level stick-breaking prior. And there's a somewhat complicated non-convex function that you need to optimize to do that, and I won't go into that here, but it's computationally it's not expensive because it's over a small number of parameters. So we can do that just like in the EM algorithm. We can use the inside-outside algorithm to calculate the expectations for the trees. So I've described the model, and
Did you, how do you choose the Q distribution? Is that just you chose something?
Well, that's what the process is. Sorry. So that's what the variational training is doing. It's learning the Q distribution. So we can derive those model update equations by making that assumption of decomposition, and then going through some steps. So you can bound the likelihood, the posterior, sorry, using Jensen's inequality, and in the end you get out those nice EM-like equations. So given the model I've described, I'm going to talk about some experiments. This is still quite early, so our experiments are still somewhat exploratory. But first I'll describe a synthetic experiment trying to recover a simple synthetic grammar using the model to see if it behaves like we'd hope. So we have very simple grammar. We have a single production which produces, a single binary production S which produces A's and B's. We have a reordering rule there with the B's, so we have 2 monotone S rules and 1 reordering. And then for the A, B, and C, they each can emit a source and target symbol from those sets. So what we do is we randomly generate 10,000 examples using that grammar, and then train our model, and we also train a maximum likelihood model using the EM algorithm, and see what happens. So here in blue is the Bayesian hierarchical Dirichlet process model, and in red is the maximum likelihood model. And on the left is the binary production distribution, and on the right is the emission distributions. So if we just look at the left to start with, so remember there is one binary production rule S, production category S. And we can see that from the blue bar there, the Bayesian model's allocated that to category 2, and it's learnt a single constituent, whereas the maximum likelihood has split that over two constituents, 2 and 5. So it's split the S over 2 constituents. On the right, we have the emission distribution, and we can see that different the hierarchical Dirichlet process has nicely allocated 3 categories for the 3 different emission constituents. Whereas the maximum likelihood model's got somewhat confused. It's actually combined 2 categories together into label 1 there, and split another one over 3 and 4. So the reason this is happening is because the maximum likelihood model has no prior to use a small number of constituents. So it has nothing forcing it to use a small number. So it uses all of them. So it's used the 5 there that it was given. The hierarchical Dirichlet process model does have a prior to use as few as it can, and therefore it seeks to minimize the number and comes up with the right grammar. These results, of course, are, because it's a non-convex optimization, are dependent on the initialization point. And if you initialize the maximum likelihood model with the correct solution, it will stay there. But if you don't, it will probably not find the correct solution. The hierarchical Dirichlet process, because of the priors, tends to always find the correct solution, although I couldn't guarantee that. It did every time I tried it. Okay. No. Okay, sorry. So moving on to a real translation task, I'm going to reuse the experiments I described earlier from the IWSLT data. Have basically the same setup as those previous experiments. So something I've not talked about so far is that the downside of this nice variational training approximation is that obviously we can't represent an infinite number of constituents, so we have to approximate that somehow, and that's called the truncation of the distribution. So we have to choose an upper limit on our approximation. So it's not like in a maximum likelihood model where we're actually allocating that number of constituents, we're just setting an upper limit on the approximation. The model can still choose to use less. So we need to truncate that number of constituents. And in these initial experiments, we haven't gone very high. So I'll do one experiment where we just have a single category, and then we just look at what the emission distribution is doing, and then an experiment where I'll use 5 constituent labels. We also need to truncate the phrase translation pairs, and in these experiments, I'm just using a standard phrase table from the translation system Moses. This is not a limitation of the model. This is just how I did these initial experiments. Obviously, we would want to remove that in future experiments. And again, we have this problem of unreachability, and we discard about 7,000 of the training sentences, which we can't model with that grammar. So a quick comment about some of these hyperparameters. So there's quite a number of hyperparameters, and I'll just look at one of them, which is of interest, is the rule type distribution. So a major motivation for having these priors is that if we train a maximum likelihood model with phrases, it'll find what's called a degenerate solution. So the maximum likelihood solution is to place all the weight on the longest possible phrases. And this is not a good solution. And if you have no limit on the length of phrases, it'll always allocate all the probability on full sentence translations.
So that's a little bit peculiar, right? Would you like to have your prior to aggressively favor short phrases?
Yeah.
So is it that the DPs are not kind of aggressive enough on the in sensor, going low probability to long phrases?
No, so I'm saying that the maximum likelihood suffers from the degenerate solution.
Oh.
Once we introduce the DPs, that's why we're introducing them.
Sorry, I haven't
So the way, so we can, the distribution which has most effect on this is the rule type distribution. So if you imagine the longer the phrases we use, the lower the depth of the tree that will result, the less internal nodes we'll have. And the deeper the tree, the shorter the phrases on the leaves. So if the rule type distribution is biased towards omitting phrases, we'll get shallow trees. If it's biased towards binary productions, we'll get deeper trees. So what we see when we vary this parameter alpha y, which is the parameter on the rule type Dirichlet process, is that we actually want very high values. So this is not sparse, it's the opposite. It's suggesting that we're trying to flatten the distribution. And that's because the model itself is trying to learn very shallow trees and place all the weight. It's trying to find a sparse distribution in which it really wants to omit phrases. And by forcing it to spread some of the probability mass to the binary productions, we get deeper trees.
One problem that you could have is that the models actually, you get a funny hierarchical grammar, right, where you don't have, which is sort of divergent if you do this. If you put a lot of the probability on rules versus versus terminals, then you might have not a problem, stochastic grammar.
It could push some of the degeneracy into the grammar.
Well, you get this branching process where most of the probability is to keep going rather than emitting terminals.
But the
So I'm not sure what that does to your
but
math.
the likelihood to optimize the likelihood is fighting that. So the two are fighting each other. I mean, this is basically a hyperparameter. So we're setting this by hand to try and find the balance on development data. Yeah.
Is this just one parameter?
So this is the parameter for the rule type distribution. Every distribution has a parameter, and I tuned them all on the development data by hand. You can infer the parameters. You can place a prior on the hyperparameters to automatically infer those, which is another step again in the modelling. But here I've just done hand tuning of hyperparameters.
So there are 3 of them.
There is one for the rule type distribution. I just use a single parameter for both productions, reordering and monotone.
Okay.
You could have separate ones, but I just use a single one. There's a parameter on the stick breaking prior, an alpha, and there's a parameter on the start rule distribution, and the emission distribution. Did I mention that one? Yeah. There's a number of hyperparameters. Some of them are more important than others. The rule type one's one that's really quite important.
Isn't your value of 10 to the 5 remarkably large for this sort of parameter?
Well, these models seem to if you look at the literature, people do seem to find very large. So it's often very large or very small. You get something like 10 to the negative 10 or something, or maybe not that high, but 10 to the negative 5 or 10 to the 5. It does seem to be that way. Yeah, I mean, you could say that it's so high that we're just saying find a flat distribution. But then it does actually go up and down, so there's something going on there. It could also be related to the sheer size of the corpus, because we're talking about 40,000 sentences, and there's a relationship there in the scale of the parameters that we're talking about. But yes, I'm not exactly sure why we find such large numbers. So yeah, the interesting result there is that there is that bias in the model, and that we can counter it with the rule type distribution. So for some blue scores using this model, the top level is just the EM trained maximum likelihood model, and then we have 3 Bayesian models using the different emission parameters, and this is just with a single category, so there's no stick breaking prior going on here because we just have a single category. And we see that as we use just using the Bayesian approach, we get an increase in blue score. All of this is without a language model. So we're trying to learn the translation model just strictly in the grammar. And as we add the prior, such as model 1 and relative frequency, we see increases again with the 2 priors giving similar, so slightly biased towards the relative frequency there. Yeah, so as I'm saying here, the maximum likelihood model is overfitting its finding very long phrases. So the ability to add interesting priors like this, I think, is quite a nice property of these sort of models, of the fact that we can add this prior information into the distributions. And things like the relative frequency estimator, it's not a proper generative model in any sense, but we can sort of still use it within a nicely behaved model in this way. As we add some more categories, what the maximum likelihood model overfits even more because we give it more parameters, more degrees of freedom, and so its performance goes down. Whereas the Bayesian model essentially stays the same. It's gone up very slightly. So we're not seeing a great deal of change of performance by adding the categories. Obviously, this is very few categories, 5, but I'll explain that there are some computational problems with going higher.
I don't think any benefit either, right?
So the benefit's tiny. I think it's 0.1 or 0.2. But we do see that the model doesn't overfit like the maximum likelihood model, so the priors itself will work. So to characterize, well, what's actually going on with these 5 categories, there's very few, so we're not going to see any sort of complex syntax going on. But we do see things like the first thing the model will do when we give it more than one category is allocate a category to the start symbol. So that's the one it likes to allocate first. And after that, it likes to allocate a symbol for the start of a sentence. So we see that a symbol comes to omit all things like the question words, like what, where. There's lots of questions in this corpus. So we get a symbol that models the start of the sentence and the rest. And we see the similar thing for the end. But that's basically the extent of the structure we see. And if we are really hopeful, occasionally we see a sort of reordering category, but not consistently. So to summarise what we've sort of found, these are just initial experiments. So my feelings are that, I mean, what we're talking about here is an extremely simple model of constituency. And if we do really want to capture interesting syntactic reorderings or something like that in an unsupervised way, we're going to have to do more heavy modelling. We're going to have to look at context and things like that. And in terms of the efficiency of this model, doing this with a single category scales really well. We could train on millions of sentences using a cluster without too much trouble. Adding the more categories slows things down very quickly. So that's why with the variational approximation, you have to represent as much of the number of categories that you've chosen, which is a bit of a limitation. So I'll just summarise what I've presented today. So I've presented the Bayesian model. So I presented our work with the discriminative probabilistic model and argued that we can use that to incorporate these sparse features in much the same way that we've done that in other fields in NLP, in parsing and sequence modelling and such, and seen benefits. And I've described non-parametric Bayesian model and shown some initial experiments with that. So where we're going from here, so with the discriminative framework, a prime concern is scaling. It is a heavy model, and we'd like to be able to train it on more data. And we'd like the ability to optimize more interesting loss functions than likelihood and the natural options there are expected loss because it's a probabilistic model, so things like expected blue. And on the Bayesian model, as I said, from our initial experiments, I'm moving more towards a sampling approach to try and estimate these models, an approach that might let us induce the categories as we use them rather than having to represent them all up front. So I'm currently experimenting with ways to do that and whether we'll be able to do that more efficiently. And of course, we also want to remove any dependency on those initializing alignments through the phrase table. Okay, so thank you. That was the presentation.
So if you talk to Percy and the Berkeley guys, they kind of gone cold on the hierarchical Dirichlet process. Very difficult to get the prior to do exactly what they want. So they tended to, so they tended to go this more empirical methods which do rule splitting and merging.
Yeah.
Which was sort of an old-fashioned idea that didn't have a nice math behind it, but seems to be more scalable for them and get better results.
Yeah.
So you have something to, the fact that you're trying these means that you don't believe them, or
no, not at all. So I'm no sort of Bayesian zealot. I don't believe in it for its own sake. And if you look at the results, there's not very many positive results using Bayesian model comparing it to a map estimate. You normally see basically the same result. So I'm interested in the Bayesian models when the modeling actually gives you something that you can't do as easily without that. And with the constituents, as you say, you can use state splitting approaches like that. I think the most promising thing with the Bayesian model is being able to explore the space, especially of the translation pairs rather than the constituents, without ever enumerating it. So through samplers and such we don't need to use alignments and such, and we can explore the space of grammar rules by a sampler or some procedure. So I think I think the Bayesian models are interesting when you actually do have something which is non-parametric. When your model is small and you have you expect a small number of categories or a small number of terminals, I think there's much less argument for using it. But my hope is that when you have a model which does have very large or infinite parameter spaces, such as the translation equivalences, that we'll be able to see some benefits. So that's what I'm hoping to get out of it. But I don't have any bias towards using it for its own sake. And especially in the approach that they were doing at Berkeley, it was they were looking at a small number of splits of categories and not inducing terminals, and they had fixed trees. So I think using simpler models, you'd get very good results.
Thank you.